I have a story for you about 30 moments when the mother of Jesus stepped into the ordinary lives of Americans and did what no one else could do. It begins the way a lot of American stories begin, with a road, a lone driver, and a question. On a winter night, a Catholic journalist named Grant sat beneath a highway overpass outside Omaha. Engine off. Snow whispering against the windshield. He had spent months gathering first-hand accounts of Marian intercession for a long-form feature that no one at his newsroom believed would hold readers' attention. You can't keep people for more than 30 seconds, his editor had said. Prove me wrong. Grant pressed record on a small, battered voice memo device. It captured the soft thrum of the wind and the words he said to no one. I'm going to tell this straight, he whispered. No special effects. Just truth as it was told to me. 30 moments. 30 flames that refused to go out. He began. The first call came from a retired parish priest in western Kansas, Father Kendall, whose hands trembled as he described what happened when a wildfire rushed toward a clapboard church on a prairie ridge. Inside stood a century-old statue of the Blessed Mother that parishioners refused to abandon. Father Kendall was pushing 80, with a bad hip and a sermon voice that still shook walls, but the statue weighed more than he did. He fell to his knees among the pews and said one sentence. Mother, if you want to be saved, save yourself. He rose, gripped the base, and gasped. The wood felt light as laundry fresh from the line. He hoisted the statue alone, staggered down the front steps, and carried it past the fire line while ash snowed like confetti. When he set it down in the gravel lot, it was heavy again. Fire crews arrived. Flames turned. The church was scorched yet standing. He never boasted about it. He just kept saying, She made my burden light, like a mother who snatches a backpack from a child and says, I've got it, too. In South Philly, where row homes lean like neighbors in conversation, a seminarian's dream almost died for lack of tuition. Orphaned and broke, the boy his name was Victor wrote a letter to the Blessed Mother and tucked it beneath a statue in the side chapel of St. Rita's. The pastor, Father Maurice, found it the next morning and wept as he read. That same week, a widowed philanthropist, Uptown Mrs. Lambert, woke from a dream in which a woman in blue placed a folded note in her hands and said, Help him. The handwriting on the paper in her dream matched Victor's slanted print when she arrived at St. Rita's unannounced and asked the sacristan to check under Mary's feet. She paid 4 years in full. Victor is a priest now. He never met another donor quite like her. And she insisted it had been the mother's doing, not hers. 3. In Shreveport, a kitchen fire ate through an old convent. When the sisters scattered to the lawn, they counted heads and realized Sister Wren was missing. Black smoke poured from the dormitory. Seconds later she stepped through it, calm as Sunday morning, wearing a blue shawl stitched with a heart and lilies. The shawl was untouched. Her hair smelled of smoke, but not one thread was singed. She said later that she pressed the metal at her throat and whispered, Mother, please, and felt an invisible wall rise between herself and the flames, the way a mother steps between her child and a stranger. For, in Burlington, a muralist named Cole painted Our Lady with a serpent crushed beneath her heel. At the edge of each canvas he hid a tiny, snarling figure, his way of telling the truth about evil, even as gallery owners told him not to be so dramatic. One night, after a scaffolding collapse in a church nave, he fell from the choir loft and had just enough time to cry out, Mary, help me. He landed on his back as if lowered by ropes. The fall that should have shattered bone left him bruised and humbled. When he looked up, the mural's face seemed brighter, the blues deeper. He stopped placing little demons in his work, not because he feared them, but because he wanted viewers to see only the calm, unafraid woman whose presence had turned his panic into rest. A National Guard sergeant in El Paso, Juliet, and her wife had 4 kids and too many bills. Their housekeeper, Corinne, suffered seizures that intensified until neighbors begged them to let her go. Juliet refused. They began a simple novena together on the back steps each night while the desert cooled and the cicadas sang. On the 10th morning, after communion at the tiny chapel by the base gates, Corinne awoke and did not seize again. The neurologist shrugged. Juliet did not. Thanksgiving Mass that year was the loudest her family had ever sung. 6. In Duluth, a Carthusian-minded hermit living in an apartment over a bait shop his name, Benton drifted toward despair during a brutal January illness. One midnight he sensed a presence darker than the lake. In a dream that did not feel like a dream, a ledger of sins fluttered open, pages damning and exact. The voice in the room hissed, "You are mine." Then he heard another voice, quiet and urgent, "Do not be afraid." A woman stood beside him with a child in her arms. She stepped between him and the shadow, as if the shadow were a gust you could block. She prayed in a language he did not know but somehow understood, and he woke up with a priest's phone number on the tip of his tongue. He confessed 3 decades in an hour. When he walked home across the ice-rimmed lot, the air seemed newly made. 7. At a parish in Baton Rouge where weekday mass draws shift nurses and short-order cooks, the pastor keeps a ledger of names on a table before an icon of the Mother. The names belong to the dead for whom the living pray. Some folks roll their eyes at the phrase time of purification. Some do not. But on feast days, that ledger is heavy with petitions. And the parish has stories too many to count off impossible reconciliations and long-sought mercies that arrived the week the names were written down. In a brick bungalow on the south side of Chicago, an 8-year-old Lyle came home bragging that he had received First Communion before his father thought he should. The father, angry and drunk, shoved him toward a wood stove as if he could punish the sacrament out of him. Lyle toppled into the open door. He sat as if on a pew, as clear, hair unscorched. He climbed out without a blister and said, "She held me." The father quit drinking the next week, then asked the deacon how to begin again. 9. In a rehab ward in Spokane, a man whose life was a tangle of lies and hustles, Tad felt death stealing into his chest. He had mocked belief his whole life, but in that hour he begged for help from a mother he had never spoken to. He dreamed of her hands lifting his chin. When the chaplain came and anointed him, Tad cried like a child, vowed to set things right, and died with a priest's hand on his brow. The room strangely bright. In a Cleveland hospice, a nurse named Nora keeps rosary beads in a drawer for families who haven't prayed in years. On the assumption, she swears the halls grow quieter, like a city after snowfall. Skeptics are free to scoff. She counts the ones who, on that day, die reconciled, after months of panic, as if someone sat at their bedside and sang. 11. An old monk brother Meriton, a monastery tucked in the Rockies, saw a book in a fever dream, pages listing his every failure. A snarling voice and the weight of the thing on his chest convinced him he was lost. Then a woman entered the room carrying an infant whose gaze pierced him. He heard one sentence in his spirit: "I will not abandon those who hope in me," and felt peace like a tide roll in. He smiled at the brothers who gathered around his bed and said, "I can see them." He died like a man walking into light. 12. In a parish founded by immigrants outside Boston, a group gathers every Saturday to pray for the departed. On Marian feasts, they bring flowers for the statue in the courtyard. An engineer named Byron swears that, on the queenship of Mary, he heard a clear interior command to call his estranged brother and say the words that would free him. He did. Sometimes the miracle is not a flash of light but the softening of a jaw, the lowering of a guard. 13. A lender in Phoenix, rich on interest and indifference, got a prognosis he could not buy off. Alone in a waiting room, he whispered one prayer he remembered from childhood. A calm fell over him like shade at noon. He confessed, sold the second house, paid back what he could. When a friend mocked the change, a car crash ended the laughter. People argue over what to call that: judgment, coincidence, consequence. The man calls it a mercy with sharp edges. 14. In Chattanooga, a woman caroled still while machines mapped her pain. She dreamed of a blue mantle draped across her shoulders and woke without pain. Doctors could not chart the reason, but they signed the discharge all the same. She filled her days with casseroles and rides to the clinic for strangers whose names she never learned. 15. In Newark, a laborer miles wasted to bone by a sickness no one could arrest, knelt in the back of a church below a painting of a young mother. He felt a hand on his shoulder, stood, and the weakness left him as if someone opened a window and let it out. He went back to work on Monday. If you ask him now what happened, he shrugs and points at the painting. 16. In a ranch house outside Fresno, a mother named Daria had run out of options and tears. A virus ate at her like rust. After months of novenas, she slept and dreamed that someone sat on her bed and spoke 4 words: "You are not alone." In the morning her fever was gone and her labs confused her doctors. "Not everything has a name," her physician muttered. Daria said, "This does." 17. 40 miles off the Louisiana coast, a squall capsized a shrimp boat with a crew of 42. The Gulf chewed like a mouth full of teeth. In the foam and thunder a deckhand named Calvin shouted Hail Marys until his voice went. A Coast Guard cutter cut through black water like a blade and hauled them, everyone, aboard. The captain's report uses the word providence without apology. 18. In a children's ward in Miami, a 16-year-old Dre slipped so far toward the end that her mother began the prayers you say when hope is an insult. Family and hospital staff circled her bed with beads. By morning, color returned to raised cheeks like sun rising along a horizon. The recovery made no medical sense, but it happened all the same. 19. In a cardiology clinic in Denver, a 10-year-old June waited for a transplant that would not come. Her mother drove to a nearby chapel each night to whisper the memorare into a quiet that felt crowded. The next morning, June's heart found a rhythm it had not known, as if a maestro tapped a baton and the musicians remembered their parts. XX. In a Benedictine guest house in rural Missouri, a priest Father Rowan curled around his pain like a question mark. He begged the mother for one more season to serve. He slept under a quilt sewn by oblates and woke with pain gone and plans in his head for 3 new ministries. Even his enemies had a few. Priests admitted something had happened that no spreadsheet could explain. XXI. A priest in Detroit, Father Noble, suffered months of angina that wrapped around his chest like a band and squeezed. One night, a glow like moonlight pooled around his shoes in the rectory chapel. He felt free for the first time since he had learned the word diagnosis. He lives stubbornly now, scolding anyone who tells him to slow down. XXII. In a flood-ripped town in eastern Kentucky, a pastor named Abel led the parish on a pilgrimage up to a Marian shrine carved into a hillside. They prayed not just for roofing and drywall but for hearts too. Within a week, grants arrived from places they had never applied. The lumber yard donated what they could not afford. But the bigger miracle was the way neighbors who had not spoken in years found themselves swinging hammers on the same porch. XCI. In a Colombian immigrant parish in Queens with a devotion older than their visas, one spring storm filled basements and took cars down the avenue like toys. Mothers kneeled at a makeshift altar while sirens flashed outside. The rain slackened as if someone turned the knob down, and emergency trucks finally made it through the maze of stalled vehicles to pull people from attics. Ziv. On a hospital floor in Laredo, a 17-year-old Haven paralyzed from a wreck lay with her gaze fixed on ceiling tiles as if she were learning to count the squares as companions. Her mother pressed her hand to a medal and asked for what doctors assured her could not return. Night wind rattled the room's vent. In the morning, Haven curled 2 fingers toward her palm. A week later, she stood. The rehab nurse cried in the hallway where no one would see. XXV. In Santa Fe, a solitary Manquinho's default setting was distrust. Walked into a church not his own and told a statue he was terrified. 2 weeks later, scans came back clean. He took a seat in the back pew on Sunday and wept through the Gloria without trying to hide it. XXVI. A woman in Oregon, blind since birth, got lost on a trail when her brother wandered too far and the light shifted. Panic rose up like a tide. She stretched out her hand and felt a smaller hand take it, warm and certain. She was led over rocks she could not see, along a path she did not know, to the parking lot's hot asphalt. She turned to thank whoever had helped her. The air was empty and still. XXVII. Off the New Jersey coast, a Coast Guard diver Vaughn pulled a body from wreckage long after anyone expected breath. A group on shore gathered in a circle, praying as if they had never stopped. A pulse returned like a knock from inside a locked door. The man coughed up seawater and said one word before slipping back into sleep. Mother. Teeny-eye. In a farmhouse outside Ames, a little Gerliva blind from birth traced the shape of her mother's face with her fingers after a parish feast day and then blinked in surprise. Light stung. Color poured in. She looked at a daisy with the attention of a scientist and a poet and said its name out loud for the first time. 6. In a Texas prison, a man on death row Harlan kept a picture of the mother taped above his bunk. On the morning of his execution, an attorney burst in with a court order that changed everything, based on evidence no one had been able to find for years. Harlan walked out 2 years later and works now in a parish pantry, quiet and steady. If you press him, he says, a mother does not let her child die alone. XXX. In a duplex in Buffalo, a single Mamadella folded laundry and waited for a phone call that never came. Oncology results. She prayed not to be brave but to be allowed to live long enough to see report cards and graduations. When the doctor said the scans were clear, Adele took the bus to church, sat in the last pew, and whispered, "Thank you," the way some people whisper names into ears they love. Grant clicked off the recorder and looked through the windshield at the interstate, a relentless lane of red taillights. He had not fabricated a syllable. He had not sweetened the hard parts or pretended that prayer turns the world into a soft place. He had simply recorded one thing that kept repeating in different cities and different lives. When people asked, a mother came. But his editor would still ask the question the world asks when it is trying not to be moved. Why should anyone believe these things? Because, Grant thought, they are coherent in the way love is coherent. Not logical like a math proof. Coherent like the way a mother will stand in a doorframe during a storm and tell the wind it cannot have her children. He remembered the Midwest priest carrying a statue that turned light, and the Philly donor with the dream letter, and the nun's unburned shawl. He heard the monk whisper, I can see them. He saw the boy rise from a stove without a burn and the girl open her eyes to daisies. He thought of the man spared from execution and the woman spared from cancer and the crews saved at sea. He thought of all the times mercy had arrived with a stern face and a steady hand and how often it ascended into mystery the moment you tried to measure it. The next day, he drove to the newsroom with a thermos of coffee and an outline of his piece. He titled it under a simple banner, 30 Ways a Mother Keeps Her Promise. His editor, Mariah, read in silence. She was not a sentimental woman. She filed lawsuits against City Hall when they stonewalled and assigned obituaries when the rookies were too rattled. She lifted her eyebrows at the page breaks and said, You know, half the internet will scream coincidence. Then let them scream, said Grant. Maybe they'll be loud enough to hear themselves ask why anything beautiful makes them angry. We are not in the business of piety, she said. No, he answered. We're in the business of witness. She held his gaze, then nodded like a coach sending in a play and said, All right, but if we're going to ask people to give us 25 minutes of their lives, we need an opening they cannot click away from. He returned to his desk and began again, not with smoke and soft voices, but with the only argument that has ever convinced anyone of anything. A life changed. He wrote about the father in Chicago who grabbed his son and then, after the stove did not claim the boy, found himself standing in a church doorway on a Tuesday afternoon, a man with empty hands who did not know how to pray. He wrote about the shrink-wrapped fear in the hearts of men on boats and the sudden mercy of a searchlight where there should have been none. He wrote about the stubborn courage of priests with diagnoses and mothers with failing hearts and old men with ledger books full of guilt who heard a kinder voice cancel the debt. He did not argue. He told. The piece went live on a Friday, the day Catholics meditate on a mother watching her son bleed while soldiers gambled for his clothing. The traffic counter on the site ticked fast. Emails began to populate his inbox. Some called him a liar. Some called him brave. Many wrote simply to say, Thank you. The city's public radio station invited him to talk. Then a national show did. And soon he was driving again across America's wide map, collecting stories like shells. On a spring morning outside Wichita, a woman handed him a baby and said, She is here because I was not alone at midnight. In a Newark rectory kitchen, a priest poured him coffee and opened his charts to prove what could not be proved. In a Queens parish hall, a grandmother told him how the water stopped and then started again, but not the way it had before, not as a threat. The more he listened, the less he was interested in winning arguments. The more he wrote, the more he saw that the heart of every story was the same sentence said in different accents. I asked for help, and a mother came. He stitched the stories into a single film of words and images and released it as a long video essay. He narrated it himself, not as a preacher, but as a neighbor, A man who had knocked on many doors and sat in many kitchens and worn out a pair of windshield wipers in the service of a hunch. That grace still intrudes, that mercy still interferes, that light still finds its way into rooms we thought were windowless. In the final minutes, he did something his editor had warned him not to do. He spoke directly to the viewer. He asked them to hold, for just a moment, their instincts to dismiss. He asked them to let these 30 witnesses be what witnesses have always been. Flawed but honest, partial but burning with a certain kind of certainty. He did not offer a loophole or a coy, open-ended shrug. He landed the plane. Here is what these 30 say. He concluded. A mother who stood at the foot of a cross continues to stand at the foot of our beds, at the lip of our hospital gurneys, at the edge of our boats, at the hinge of our doors. When we are guilty, she pleads for us. When we are terrified, she shields us. When we are being torn apart by the violence and injustice that stain our neighborhoods as surely as they stained the hill outside Jerusalem, she does not look away. She comes. She helps. She points to her son and says, "Do whatever he tells you." And the water we thought was only water becomes something else. The video ended with a shot that did not feel like an ending. It was a close-up of a mother's hands pressing a child's head to her shoulder, just long enough to let you feel the weight of the boy and the steadiness of the embrace. Then the frame widened to reveal not who the mother was but where they stood. In a church doorway, the street beyond noisy and unconverted, the light inside steady and patient. After the credits, the comments began to bloom. Some wrote of their own nights and their own whispers. Some wrestled in public with their anger and their longing. A few mocked, as people do when something threatens to unmask them. Grant read them all, then shut his laptop and walked to the parish down the block where the noon mass was beginning. He took a place in the back pew and watched a woman in the third row with a toddler on her lap juggle a hymnal, a sippy cup, and a squirming child with the same unhurried competence as every mother he had ever known. He smiled, then bowed his head when the bell rang and the white-haired priest lifted the host and said the words. Afterward, he stood on the steps as the city moved around him, each person in their own story, and thought about how all real endings are beginnings. He thought of all the unrecorded mercies that would happen that afternoon while he was eating a sandwich or answering a hostile message. He thought of how many times a mother would stand between a child and a storm and say, "Not this one. Not today." And he knew what he would do next. The same thing he had been doing since that night under the overpass when he turned on a recorder and chose witness over certainty. He would listen. He would tell. He would keep his sentences plain and his heart open. And he would let the stories do the work only they can do. Now it is your turn. You have lived in neighborhoods where sirens sound too often, and you have seen the bruises left by violence and the small humiliations of injustice. You have watched courts make mistakes and fathers fail and mothers carry more than their share. Tell me what you think about these things. Tell me whether the stories of protection, pardon, and undeserved rescue enrage you or console you, and why. In the comments, take a stand on violence and injustice in our common life. Argue if you must. Defend what you believe is right. Say what ought to change. If you have a story of your own, share it with the rest of us who are still learning how to hope.